Okay, morning everyone. Fingers crossed this is going to work, no guarantees. Right, starting a brand new topic, we're going to be looking at the issue of metaethics, which is essentially the meaning of right and wrong. It is one of the topics that actually features on the full A-level spec, which means most people will look at it in year 13. But because it's to do with the technicalities of ethical language and ethical understanding, we kind of want to pull it together with the work that you're going to be doing, mainly with Miss Reynolds, which is looking at normative ethical theory. So what you need to know in terms for the exam is you need to be able to understand divine command theory, naturalism, which is really utilitarianism, and non-naturalism, which is intuitionism. I can never do that word every single time. And obviously the strengths and weaknesses of each, because that's the point of doing the evaluation and the AO2 questions. To clarify how this is going to work, although I'm in charge of running the meta-ethics unit, so it will be mainly me when you come to analysing stuff on the PLC. Obviously with divine command theory, I'm sure you can make a good guess as to why I'm covering that particular one, because it links directly into the work that we do within Christianity. The stuff on naturalism, because it's all to do with the utilitarian theory and going on to look at Immanuel Kant and stuff like that, which is where Miss Reynolds specialises. She's actually going to be covering that bit as part of the foundation for going into the normative ethical theory. So it's going to seem a little bit weird. We will make sure that you can untangle it. It's not like we're both trying to do divine command, we're both trying to do utilitarianism. They are split out, but it's that whole holistic nature of the course. Things do crop up left, right and centre, and we're trying to make sure that we give you the best of both of us to give you that full understanding for going through into the course. So that's the run over of what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. Obviously either virtually or hopefully, please dear God, back in the classroom, because I really don't like doing this. So I'm going to try and do a slide transition and see if this works. Okay, what is metaethics? As I've already said, metaethics is it's a very technical side of ethical theory. The bit of ethics that everyone seems to love is that application of ethical theory. Well, people feel like this about abortion, or people feel like this about euthanasia or theft and lying and everything like that because of this. That's kind of the more straightforward side. This is the advanced bit of, well, why do people talk about ethics in this way? It's about the meaning of the language, and it's kind of the similar idea that we have when talking about religious language in philosophy. What is the meaning of the terms that we actually use? Why do we use those particular terms? Do they serve any purpose? Do they have any meaning? The idea of ethical theory as an objective concept or a subjective concept. Do ethics exist regardless of whether anyone follows or believes in them, or do we as humanity create ethical constructs to satisfy a need that we have to have rules and boundaries about different ideas and different concepts? And I want you to take a brief moment to consider your own position. Why do we study ethics at all instead of just letting people make their own decisions? Why do we bother? What's the purpose of studying ethics? What's the purpose of having rules or potential boundaries or anything like that? So I'm going to say to you is pause the recording for a moment and then jot a few bits down in your notes so you have an idea. Okay. Hopefully now you've had a chance to have a think about that and to sort of come up with some ideas as to why we study ethics. Let's move on. So, as we can establish, there are loads of different types of ethical theory. You've got normative, applied, descriptive and meta. They are the four main types. I've sent you out alongside this PowerPoint the extracts from the textbook that we're going to be working through. So what I want you to do now is to create a table that defines these key terms. You can obviously see them as normal in the textbook, and summarises the four types of ethical theory that we look at. Okay, this is really important, that you put it in your own words, that you don't just copy the textbook phrasing, because you're all very guilty of it. Everyone's very guilty of it, but it means that you're not actually understanding it. You're just copying. You need to really understand what these terms actually mean and the implication they have for how people live their lives. So this is quite an extensive task. So as I said, 30 minutes, pause the PowerPoint, go away, do this piece of work, do the reading. You will probably have to read through those couple of pages 3 or 4 times for it to properly make sense, and then create this table so you've got this contrast. It's like a quick reference sheet of those 4 types of ethical theory. And obviously I'm looking at meta-ethics with you. Miss Reynolds is going to be looking at the normative and applied ethical theories with you. So it is crossing across these ideas, and it is a good way for you to get to know this information. Okay, so hopefully you now have a good understanding of those ideas, having done that particular task. I've said 30 minutes max. You really need to try and keep together with your timings to make sure that you've done it. Obviously, if it took you slightly less time, then brilliant. Try not to let it, I hope it hasn't taken much more of your time to do that. What we're looking at specifically starting today is this idea of divine command theory. We will be picking this up, and I can't remember which week we're in, so it's either going to be later in the week or it's going to be going into next week's double. So divine command theory is the idea simply that moral commands come from God. We have made reference to this all the way through. It is not based on empirical evidence. It is not an idea of an ethical theory that is built up in reaction to particular situations or particular ideas. It is literally, God says this, you must do it. The idea of divine command theory really stems from that Genesis 1:26-28, that idea of humans being imago Dei, the image of God. And if humans are in the image of God, then they must reflect the moral character of God. If they reflect the moral character of God, then human beings must be instinctively moral, but God still has needed to provide commands to help them to achieve that. And when you go in to look at the concept of evil and suffering, this is really where John Hick and his update of the Irenaean Theodicy comes into being. It's this idea of developing character to become ultimately in that full image of God. So there are essentially 2 main types of divine command. You've got the idea of revelation, and that's explicit revelation through the 10 Commandments, but then you also have implicit revelation, which is really the Bible as a whole. So obviously 10 Commandments, do this, do that, don't do this. That's really quite clear. Implicit, you've got the idea of the example of the way Jesus lives his life. You've sort of got a combination of explicit and implicit through the parables that Jesus teaches, the signs, the discourses that you see coming through in John's Gospel. But really, it tends to be quite straightforward to go 10 Commandments, very explicit, divine command, and then the implicit is Jesus did this, Jesus said this. You've got the example of Job going through into Eve and the suffering, etc. The second main type of divine command is this idea of conscience. Now, there is a whole unit that we look at in terms of the idea of conscience and ethics, so we don't need to go into it into much detail as part of this whole understanding of divine command theory, but it is worth understanding it in terms of what we've looked at over the past couple of units in relation to Christianity and the idea of sources of wisdom and authority and the nature of God. Now, I'm using the word paraclete. For some of you, you might remember the idea of the paraclete or parakletos is the Holy Spirit. It is that final part of the Trinity that has been left following the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And the word paraclete, paraclete is the anglicized version, parakletos is the original Greek. But the idea of the parakletos, it's that counselor. That's really what the word means. It is that guidance. And it is this element that God has given to mankind to provide them with this guidance, this continued guidance. So for many Christians, they would see that the idea of the Bible is not a perfect document. Jesus, the example of Jesus, is not a perfect example. So this is God acknowledging that there are going to be issues raised that his original teachings, his original guidance is not necessarily going to be able to fulfill. So he has continued and sent down or allowed a further part of him to continually exist and be immanent, so within the world. So this idea of the Paraclete linking back to that concept of the Trinity is really, really important. And now you can start to see why trinital belief is fundamental within Christian concepts and belief, because that idea that you still have this direct link to God marks humans out as being extra special. Sometimes people view the conscience as being also the internal voice of God. It is that within them. So it's quite a common thing to say, oh, I didn't do that particular thing because I felt like God wouldn't want me to do it. Personified throughout literature, you've got Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio, just all sorts. It's a quite common literary device. I mean, obviously Christmas Carol, you could say that the ghosts are a personification of the idea of conscience, etc. But for within the Christian religious belief, it is the idea of conscience comes from God. It is that divine command, that inner voice that God is guiding you to act in a particular way. Okay, I want you to read through the script below. Okay, so la 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 la. Yes, I could just blank this out and you could do it. But this is known as the Euthyphro dilemma, with a couple of additions. I'm not giving you the direct text straight from Plato, because I think you might all cry because it's too early in January to be doing something like this. So I want you to read through this and then summarise the key point or points in no more than 50 words, and it's got to be prose, not bullet points. Okay? Doing 50 words in bullet points is easy. Doing 50 words in prose as a mini paragraph, ever so more challenging. Okay, and we're going to come on to look at this dilemma in more detail as we go further, but this should give you, or start to give you, an idea of what we're looking at. So this is the Euthyphro dilemma. It's another one of those words that I quite like writing but I can never pronounce. It's the idea, is something morally right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is morally right? So this idea of going back to, as I said on the second slide, subjective versus objective ideas. As ever, I like to resort to using Crash Course because they are really, really useful, and they do have a whole very good video on divine command theory. So the two tasks that I want you to do: one, watch the video on divine command theory, and read the information on pages 114 to 116, summarise divine command theory in no more than 150 words. There is a reason that I try and put word limits on these things, because otherwise you will just spend hours and you'll write pretty much copy out the textbook, and that serves no purpose. You have limited time to write things in an exam. You need to be able to understand things very, very quickly and be able to access them as you go back. So let's work on this skill of being able to distill information down into a key point to get it ready for you. So this idea of divine command theory, what do you think? Is something right because God has commanded it to be right and good and proper? And are things wrong because simply that's what God forbids? Again, what are your thoughts on this? Try and come up with, as ever, reasons why somebody might agree with that particular statement, reasons why people might disagree with that statement, and then come up with your own opinion. A very simplistic idea, going back to the GCSE structure, but it's getting you to think about this thing all of the time. So pause the recording, about 5 minutes, just to have a think about this and see where you go with. So, divine command theory covers a range of different concepts. Okay, essentially, Any theory, as it says, can be classed as falling under divine command theory is one that believes a right moral action is one that is commanded by God and a wrong moral action is one that God forbids. Really, really general. We're not just saying divine command theory is just the 10 Commandments and what's listed in that. It's anything. And you can kind of see how this gets corrupted by Christian authorities and different groups and different Christians, looking specifically even at LGBTQ rights and the use of that particular section in Leviticus. Well, that's one tiny part that's just been magnified out of all possible proper usage. But it's being used, well, God said this, therefore it must be absolutely correct, and it is a wrong action. Well, is it then superseded by Jesus' teachings on love one another, and the only 2 commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart and love one another? Or do we stick to the Old Testament? You've heard me rant about this quite a lot, so I will try and stop myself at that point. But divine command theories are known as deontological theories. And as ever, I get to a stage where I'm halfway through a PowerPoint slide and I forget actually what I'm going to be talking about, which realistically I should pause it, but you can tell I'm treating this as a normal particular lesson. Oh yeah, natural moral law. Yeah, natural moral law is the idea that there are innate ethical rules that people just know. That it's like, I can't do the Jungian collective unconscious because that just goes too far into psychology. But the idea that people know instinctively what is right and wrong, God doesn't necessarily need to command them, but it is God who has given those rules in the first place. Okay. What I want you to do now is to spend around 10-15 minutes to mind map as many commands as you can find out that the God of Christianity has issued to his followers. You can be general, you can be specific, use your imagination, okay, and think about the different types. Please don't just stick to go, oh, I'm going to list out the 10 Commandments and that's it. No, don't be boring. You have obviously everything in the Bible, but think back to the unit that we did about sources of wisdom and authority, or sources of authority within Christianity. Not only our source of authority in Christianity, the Bible, but you've also got Jesus as a source of authority, and obviously, particularly with Catholicism, you've got the authority of the Church itself and the Pope. And what are the commands that have come through from all of that? So think about it, maybe not just mind map it, but do sort of like a target mind map. So you've got your concept in the middle, then you've got your first circle around the outside is those commands that have come, direct commands from God. There may be the implied commands from God, and then you've got implied commands from God that have come through in modern day times. Which even to the last couple of weeks with the Pope talking about the idea of saying that he's been talking about the COVID vaccine and saying that it is actually morally right and within God's plans and teachings that people should opt to have the COVID vaccine. Because there were some issues about genetic engineering and etc. and the implications that it would have on that, and whether you could as a Catholic have that given the stances on genetic engineering and stuff like that. And it's been really interesting to look at how the Pope is trying to say, no, this is within what God would command of his people in the idea of protection and love. So, pause the PowerPoint presentation, have a go at doing that, see what you come up with. Okay, the idea of religious legalism, very, very quickly, but this kind of needs to go in because this is one of the key issues that pretty much all religions actually face. The idea of divine command theory as religious legalism. Every law contained within Scripture is completely right and must be followed. Those of you who've ever seen the Louis Theroux Westboro Baptist Church, yeah, it's those. It's a really, really odd concept, but this is the idea of fundamentalism. It is across all religions. You can see it within Hinduism, you can see it within Islam, you clearly see it within Islam. You can see it within the evangelical and Pentecostal movements over in America, and it's very much an American concept when you look at the rise of Christianity and the Christian right in American politics. It can also be known as religious fundamentalism. It's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but the idea of religious legalism is really the fundamental of course, it is the basis of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism being that idea that God has said this, we must follow it at all costs because that is what is absolutely right. There is no space for interpretation. God said this, we must do it. Legalistic religions, or as you've probably heard me talk about them, codified religions, those that have very strict legal codes, Judaism and Islam in particular. But Islam really, because of this idea that the Quran is completely infallible, it was dictated to Muhammad by Allah. Okay, and Muhammad has not changed any wording of it. The Quran should not be translated, it should not be interpreted. It is an absolute document. It is the absolute correct word of Allah, the direct word of God. And therefore, what the Quran says is right. There's no changing it, there's no interpreting it. Obviously, with religious liberalism that has grown up, especially in the last 50 years or so, legalism, this fundamentalist idea, is rejected, and you come down to that idea of, well, these concept is that Sitz and Lieben idea that you get when you look at biblical theology and biblical interpretation. The idea that you should look at the society that you are within at the time to determine why those particular rules were made, and therefore, because those rules are created as reflective of a particular society at a particular time, they can't possibly still be applicable now in a time which is so utterly, completely different from what has gone before. Which is where then you get religious liberals who tend to move more towards a utilitarian concept of ethical theory rather than divine command. So you can get questions sort of going, is divine command theory an outdated theory? And it's always an interesting way, because you can say, well, of course it is, because it applies to an outdated set of societal rules. But then you look at it and we still follow things like the Ten Commandments. The fundamental concepts of the Ten Commandments you will find in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you will find in most legal processes. So is divine command as outdated as some religious liberal groups might consider it to be? Or is that again just going into a very simplistic understanding of what divine command theory actually is? So, without, preferably, looking back at the notes that you've made throughout this lesson, have a go at answering these particular questions. Then I want you to go back over your notes, go back over the lesson and self-assess. Standard green pen procedure. If you need to make any corrections, if you need to add anything or you've missed anything out, then add that in green pen. And then can you take a photo of that and email it in to me by the end of today? And by end of today, I do mean midnight. Okay, and then I can at least see that there is some vague understanding, etc., etc., and I know that you've actually bothered to do some work. Because I would quite like you to do this particular work on the basis that really you should be doing it, and otherwise it's really embarrassing standing in the middle of my classroom with a Britney headset on and I'm just talking to myself. Moving on. Well, I'm saying moving on. Pause, watch, do, and I will move on to Karl Barth. Karl Barth, you can see there's a hyperlink in the title that takes you to the Britannica article, just so you can have a reminder of who Karl Barth is, which you should already know because I have already spoken about him because of him being a very high status 20th century Christian theologian. I was about to say philosopher, but he's not. He's a Christian theologian. And what I want you to do is to read through page 117 of the extract of the textbook that I have sent you and answer these particular questions. And again, it is one of those, you will have to reread this 2 or 3 times at least for it to make sense. And I'm saying 2 or 3 times because I know I had to read through it 2 or 3 times for it to make sense, but then I was tired and it was Saturday afternoon when I was trying to do this. But you have to work through and read through the whole section. This is not a comprehension task. This is not there's a question there and you'll find the whole answer in this particular sentence. This is these questions require you to understand the whole bit to be able to put the information together to be able to answer it. So it should take you about 15-20 minutes to complete that particular piece. Okay, take a couple of minutes. Given what you know about divine command theory, what strengths can you think of that come from following divine command theory? Why is it useful to follow divine command theory in somebody's life? And then, of course, what problems can you think of come from following divine command theory? As ever, the evaluation is always really important. In terms of the exam, that's where most of your marks come from, 15 marks. Back to Euthyphro dilemma. So go back to the slide where you've got the script. Divide your page into 4 boxes and fill in as you reread the short script. What were Plato's questions? What was Robert Adams' view? What is William of Ockham's view? And what is Peter Geach's view? And then finally, what is the dilemma? Is it resolved, looking at those particular perspectives? And there is a secondary article, Word document that I'm sending out as well, which is the idea of the refutation of divine command theory through the Euthyphro dilemma. I want you to start this now, and then we will pick up on it when we do our next lesson, because I do want to go into some detail, because it is really useful, and it's another big word that you can use that makes you look really good in an exam answer. Read the information that you've been given about the Euthyphro dilemma, and what it does, it lays it out and challenges key points of the divine command theory in terms of an inductive argument. So where you've looked at inductive and deductive arguments as part of your understanding of the main arguments for the existence of God, so ontological, teleological and cosmological, I want you to understand this concept does apply to other logical theories, other logical constructs. And for evaluation and for challenge, that's one of the main ways you can challenge anything that we do in philosophy, in ethics and in Christianity. Does it make logical sense, or does it fall down on the particular logic? So what I want you to do is to write and explain the quote by Socrates that the Euthyphro dilemma is based on. Well, you've got that both in your script and in the piece of text that I'm handing out to you. What do the first, second premises of the dilemma force a believer to do? Why is the first premise rejected? What does premise 5 do? Why is premise 5 then rejected? And finally, what is the conclusion of the Euthyphro dilemma? I would suggest when setting this out, you basically label a big sheet, your notes as a subheading of Euthyphro dilemma, and you keep this as one particular section. I'm very much into the headings of stuff, so you have like an index or contents, so it's easy for you to come back to and have a look at stuff. This is the bit that is going to take you slightly longer, and this is what I want you to make sure that you finish for homework as well. So realistically, it should be a 2 hour, because it's a double lesson, and then an hour on top completing a homework. If we have an independent study session this week, as I said, I haven't got my planner in front of me, so I can't quite remember. It's confusing. It's the first morning back. Then I will be setting a piece of reading for you to be doing for your independent study. And then if we have the independent study, it means that we have a lesson on Friday, which means we'll pick up on the Euthyphro dilemma then. So that will be a total of 5 hours of work for me alone this particular week. So 2 hours the double, 1 hour homework, 1 hour independent study and 1 hour lesson on Friday. If this is the week where we don't have the independent study and therefore you don't have the hour on Friday, then it's 3 hours in total for me this week. Miss Reynolds will be issuing work out to you as well, and then we'll pick up with all of this for the double lesson next week. But I think I have